So what about people who think that, okay, that's nice and all, like, yeah, we should be healthy mentally, physically, but that should occur outside of school. The purpose of school is to focus on like career readiness. So like, how do you respond to people like that?
Well, yeah, and that kind of gets us into sort of a different area that is part of the underlying desire to pursue the leisure angle, just as a general lens or concept for me, is really guided, to put it in maybe fancier terms. It's really, for me, part of a neoliberal critique, which is to push back on the work-focused education discourses that have come to dominate life in the last 20 to 30 years. We aren't always very good at history, I would say. I happen to love history. And, John Dewey is not that historical, but of course his work is now getting more like 100 years oldish. And, Democracy in Education, one of his famous books, he had many, but that was one that some of us in education, like, I think it was 1916. I think that's about right. So around 100 years. And Democracy in Education is really pretty notable when you look at it in terms of how Dewey really speaks about education's responsibility for both the vocational and the avocational. And, Dewey, yes, he was part of the progressive education movement, but he was also a pragmatist. And so American educational thinking during that time, it's not like people were so out there in the kind of, oh, it's just all liberal education, we don't worry about what people are going to do for a living. They were very concerned about that. They were very concerned about schooling as part of vocational preparation. There's no two ways about it. But they treated it as two sides of the coin, where you had to have a vocational with it, which is to say, if you were not preparing people for a life as well as a living, then that was negligent and irresponsible as an educational institution. So it's just out of control in terms of how the political right, and I don't mean this in a political commentary sense, but just because it's not even just the political right, actually, that's maybe not accurate. It's the neoliberal forces that like to make claims that everyone benefits from a kind of work-focused education system, the basic rationality being that quality of life is equivalent to the gross domestic product. But in fact, it's nonsense. There's absolutely no evidence to back that up. And as a matter of fact, research on quality of life and happiness, for example, shows that there's not only no correlation with GDP, and sometimes there's an inverse relationship. And if you look at happiness studies, for example, which I have, it's a field. And the US is notoriously lowly ranked on studies of happiness, quality of life, all of those types of measures that speak to the kinds of values that one might imagine might be important to average people, but instead people have just been bowled over by, let's just say, the powerful in society, who continue to bulldoze through this really self-serving discourse that everything is going to go to hell in a handbasket if we don't have more math and science, STEM kind of educations. And, it's now disappeared from the websites, but if you can find archival websites, Pearson, when they were really behind the Common Core push, so prior to the Trump presidency, the Common Core was like a big thing. And if you read the mission statement of the Common Core, it was all about helping students compete in the global economy.
Mm-hmm.
And, my good friend and colleague and co-editor on the Music Making and Leisure book, Gareth Dillon Smith, I remember him, I think it was a Facebook post or something that he wrote, a while ago. He moved to the US. They had been living in England for a long time. They moved to the US. And of course, he's always fascinated by some of those cross-cultural comparison things, usually having to do with language and, biscuits and scones and stuff like that. One of the things that he observed, as kind of one of those sort of social observations, was how everyone in the US seemed to believe that they were, so proud of being the winners of a competition that no one else in the rest of the world really knew existed or cared about. Because no other country really cares about being the winner of this global race. The fact that people continue to believe that if you don't force students into, STEM fields, that somehow the US is going to fall behind, because that's all part of the STEM discourse, which is we're going to fall behind. That's how, you invoke fear through falling behind, and other countries are going to overtake us, this kind of thing. And the kind of collateral damage with that is that anything that doesn't serve that purpose becomes extraneous and becomes dispensable. And so the idea of educating for a life there's no money to be gained in that. That's not going to, in the simplistic sense of it, the GDP is not going to be increased by educating people to have a happy life. When in fact, I think, a more nuanced understanding would say, actually, when people are happier about what they do, they tend to actually be a little bit more productive. So if you really do care about that, you might actually want to do that. But that's like, why would you invest in something like music? Why would you have music or arts education in general, unless you could rationalize it as advancing the GDP?
Yeah, I've heard some people argue, well, there's not enough time in the school day for even learning how to like balance a checkbook. Like that's for whatever reason is like a common phrase, even though people don't have checkbooks anymore. But like it's the concept behind it that I think they're trying to get at. And it's like, okay, well, I mean, yes, you're right. We're not going to have enough time in the school day for everything. But does that mean that we focus 100% on career readiness? Or like what's the balance that we try and strive for? Like, do you have an ideal? Because you have 2 daughters. Like, did you aim for a school that like tried to strive for a balance between leisure and work, or was that not a consideration?
Well, I mean, I guess the work, non-work, sort of leisure versus work dichotomy, it can be helpful, and obviously I talked about Dewey and that combination of vocation and avocation, but especially now in a kind of pandemic and eventually hopefully post-pandemic world, I think if there's any potential silver lining, who knows if it'll materialize, but I think it's really caused so many people to reflect upon the role of work, the nature of work, their relationship with work in ways that has sort of been glossed over or forgotten about or just flown under the radar up until now as everything just intensifies. And I think it's fascinating for so many people who have now had the kind of work from home experiences, and whether they think about it in terms of lines between work and non-work, or if they think about it in a kind of holistic way, because it very much depends, I think, on what the specific nature of work is. As a university professor, where is the line between my work and my leisure? I mean, it kind of blurs. I mean, there are certainly aspects of my job that, I mean, there's no way to paint it as leisure. I mean, it's just work. It's grunt work that has to get done. And I'm not talking about anything teaching wise, which I love, but I just mean like there are certain service things and there are certain, like you can't get away from attending certain meetings that, I mean, what do I get out of that? Nothing. But when I think about, scholarship or even the teaching aspects, I mean, this I find enriching and rewarding, and I think it's good. So to your question, when I think about, my daughters, for example, what I really care about is not so much work or non-work, but rather their eventual happiness and well-being. But I think in that sense, one of the things that concerns me is that they have enough interests and develop enough skills, capacities, dispositions to be able to avail themselves of those interests, that they can feel good about their lives. And to avoid the dichotomous sort of work, non-work, not everybody has the same number of chances. And so there are some people of necessity, they find themselves having to work for a living and doing work that is not in any way rewarding and can never be rewarding. You can try as you want to, but I mean, there are some things that just have to be done and, they may not be rewarding. So then how do you construct a wonderful life, a beautiful life, a meaningful life, knowing that you have to do this thing that is unavoidable? Because most of us have to do things, I have to take out the trash and nobody's going to do it for me. I have to do it and I can complain about it, but it has to be done. And, I can try to make it as enjoyable as I want to, but at the end of the day, it's taking out the trash. But if I have to take out the trash, what else can I do to live a meaningful life? And I think that that's where, if we can put our spotlight there, I think it would go a long way to undoing some of what I think has been a very harmful path that we've been on for a long time. I mean, just look at what has become of education. I mean, it's just a mess. I mean, it's a mess everywhere. In the US, it's especially a mess because of the sort of fracturing of the haves and the have-nots. I mean, that's a very unfortunate thing, because then the things that are seen as frivolous or expendable are usually the kinds of things that learners in less well-resourced areas, more impoverished areas, the learners that most benefit from those things that value engagement are usually cut out as saying, well, no, that's what these people don't need. And it's a travesty, it's shameful, and it's hard to believe that anyone who has a nuanced understanding of education would ever do that. But of course, people think they're acting in someone else's best interests. And, no, what they really need is to improve their test scores. If they want to have a shot at a happy life, they need to, yes. And so we're going to improve their test scores by cutting out all of the things in education that these students might find any sort of personal satisfaction from. Let's eliminate that from them, and let's turn schooling into the worst drudgery imaginable, and that's going to help them the most. I mean, that's just ludicrous, right? It's just silliness.
This excerpt of the CSK8 podcast is from episode number 71, which is titled Considering Leisure in Education with Roger Mantie.